Hey, it's Random Code here, and today we're going to continue working on my full stack CRUD application. And today I have already created a simple setup for my put, and I'll then showcase how it works. So just to sum up and showcase the last few videos, we now have a setup where we have a database, MySQL running inside a Docker container. We then have a basic Spring Boot application running where we can now call localhost 8080 users to get a list of all the users. We can then post to create a new user. So 8080/create-user. We can give it a name, email, and status. Let's give it Adam. And it will then return the ID of the inserted user. So in this case 2. We could then either get user ID or we just again showcase all users. So we now have Hans and Adam. I have then also added a put functionality where we can give it the ID. So we know that Hans, or let's do Adam, he has an ID of 2. So I would give the request parameter of 2. We can then inside our body as JSON give it either a name, email, status, or just one of them or two of them. So we don't need to add and change everything, we just change some of it. So let's actually showcase. So we now see we now have 2 Adam, email, and OK. Let's just say it's no longer going to be Adam. It's going to be Leah. So we're just going to change the name of the user with ID 2. We get a status code 200, and I just return the ID for now. We can then test our check and see now for ID 2, Leah have been updated. We could then also just change everything. So now both Leah, the mail, and the status code. And I'll then send this again. We can check, and everything's updated. So if you watched my last video, this is actually kind of similar, at least some of it. Inside our controller, we then now have a put mapping instead of a post or get mapping. We have the update user, the path. We then simply have our request parameter for our ID and our HTTP entity for our body. We then simply send our ID and our body to our user service on the update user method. And then we're actually doing the exact same thing here as I did last time. So just simply I copy paste it, where we just simply checks if a user is updated, we will return an option containing a user. If it's updated, return the ID and the status code OK. If it's not, if something fails, we just return an empty optional, and we would then simply return the conflict status code. Let me just showcase, for example, if we tried to insert or update a user 5, the user 5 does not exist, so we get a 4.9 conflict, which probably isn't the most telling status code, but for now I think it's fine. Inside our user service, we then previously had our, or we still have, but we previously built our get user, get all users, insert new user, and we now have an update user. As we just saw, it takes in the ID and the HTTP entity. To then always make sure that the ID is actually existing already, I then first have a just empty optional, which is going to be the updated user going to be returning at last. And we then also have old user, where we simply call our user repository. So we actually extract the user from the repository based on the ID. So we now have an optional. If it exists, if it does not exist, we simply do a check. Does old user exist? So old user is empty. So if there's actually not any users with this ID, we just straight up return our updated user and it's still going to be empty. So we just do a guard class where we simply check, or called clause, where we check if there's no old user with this ID, just don't do anything else, just return directly that something's wrong, we have a conflict. So we're now at here, we now know our old user with this given ID actually exists. The next step is then to take our JSON body and turn it into a user model. So some data we can actually work with. And here we're actually using the exact same JSON to user model method I've used in the last video. So I'm not going to go through it again, but otherwise you can have a look at the last video or look at the code yourself. So just simply, we're just transforming if possible. Not possible, it's going to be returning an error message in the console. But if it is possible, we now have a user inside our optional. We then simply check if the user was possible. So if this was possible to transform our JSON to a user model, we now know that we are at a state where we have old user present and a updated or new JSON data for the new user present. I then created a new update user method, which simply takes in our new user information inside our user model and our old user inside our user entity given from our database. And it is then constructed in the way that if we give it a name, it's going to have a name. But if we do not give it a name, it's going to be a user model where name is going to be null. So we can then simply run through all our new user information and check if the new user information that get name is not equal to null. So if a name is present, update the name in our user. We then simply check if email present, update email, if status present, update status, and then return the user. So technically, we could send a empty body here with the ID and nothing would happen because everything's just going to be null. Or we can send the same data, which would technically just rewrite the data, but it's going to be the same. So very simply, this then return our user entity. We will then take our user entity and save it to our database, our user repository. And Spring Boot and the connection we made to our database work in the way that if a user is saved with no ID, it will then create a new user and generate an ID as we did in the insert new user method. But if we then save a user with an ID, because our ID is given here, and then it's going to be indirectly given because we are extracting the user with this ID, so it's going to have this ID. And we're not updating the ID because the ID cannot be updated. It's a primary key, should not be able to be updated. So we save a user with the same ID. It's then going to be like overwritten in the database. And actually, just to showcase, I think it's actually very important to note that when we are here, like setting for our user entity, setting our name and email and status code, we then have a setup where we can get ID, get name, get email, and get status. But you can only set name, set email, and set status. We do not have a set ID, and our ID is private, so it shouldn't ever be possible to change the ID, which is a pretty good practice. But for now, we then simply have everything set up. We have changed the user if needed. We then update our updated user with an optional of our returned user, which is the user that has been updated and saved to the database. And we then return this user to our controller, and it works. So that would be my relatively quick walkthrough of how we now have also added a put mapping to my CRUD application. Just to sum up, we now have a backend connected to a database, MySQL in a Docker container, or Spring Boot backend. We now have a get, post, and put. And we then need like last functionality for our user, which we're going to be developing in the next video, which is going to be a delete. And I actually don't know if we would use the delete call directly. We could, I don't know, I'll have to actually read out on that. But that is what we have now. So I hope you enjoyed this quick walkthrough of my put mapping in Spring Boot. If you did, please leave a like and subscribe. And I wish you all a wonderful